Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Matt Abbott. I'm the Director of Government and Diplomatic Programs here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's discussion with Jared Cohen, author of the new book which debuted on the New York Times bestseller list, Accidental Presidents, 8 Men Who Changed America. And we're honored to say that the book still remains 4 weeks later on the bestseller list. Before we get started, by way of housekeeping, the Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Please silence your phones, but not your voices. This event is on the record and we are live streaming, and we welcome your social media engagement. Following the discussion, we will take questions from the audience as well as through Conferences.io. Please type chi.cnf.io directly into your browser and select today's program. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Jared Cohen is the founder and chief executive officer of Jigsaw. He previously served as a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff and was a close advisor to both Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton. He is the best-selling author of 4 books, including Accidental Presidents, 8 Men Who Changed America, which will be available for sale and signing immediately following this program by our partners, The Bookseller. After his remarks this afternoon, he will be joined in conversation with Council President Ivo Daalder. Now please join me in welcoming Jared Cohen.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me. I understand you just inaugurated a mayor, so congratulations to the great city of Chicago. Thank you, Ivo, and the Chicago Council, and again, all of you for taking time out of your day today. I'm going to talk to you about what has really been a lifelong passion, which is the 8 times in history a president has died in office and how history was changed by a heartbeat. And we'll wait for the conversation part of the program to get into why such a sort of strange, exotic passion has kind of festered in my brain for so long. But what I want to do today is paint a high-level picture of what I talk about in the book, tell you about the first time it happened, tell you about the most disastrous example, the most unexpected, and then share a few stories with you along the way. So when you look at the history of presidential succession, the longest period of time, the 2 longest periods of time without a president dying in office were George Washington to William Henry Harrison, and then the assassination of Kennedy all the way to the present. So between 1841 and 1963, the president of the United States literally died in office every 10 to 20 years. Now, in addition to the 8 times a president died in office, you also had 19 times that the president nearly died in office. And what I find extraordinary is the framers of the Constitution, they didn't think much about the vice presidency. They almost didn't have a vice president. They ended up adding it as an afterthought, as an electoral mechanism, because they needed to do something about the person who got the second largest number of votes, because back then you cast 1 vote for the president of the United States, and the second place was vice president. And when it turned out that they kept having a problem of ties, they ended up passing a 12th Amendment to cast 2 separate votes, one for the president and one for the vice president. So if you look at the history of presidential succession, we basically winged it. It's arguably the most sustained constitutional vulnerability that we've had in the history of our republic. And let me take you back to the very first time that it happened. So first, let's look at the presidential campaign of 1840, nicknamed the Log Cabin Campaign, the famous catchphrase, Tippy Canoe and Tyler too. William Henry Harrison, a great Whig general, the first Whig to occupy the presidency. John Tyler of Virginia, who was basically a Democrat, was thrown onto the Whig ticket to win Virginia and be a nod to states' rights. They didn't get the nod to states' rights, and they ended up losing Virginia. John Tyler understood the irrelevance of the vice presidency and saw this as kind of a finale in his career. William Henry Harrison delivers the longest inaugural address in history, over an hour and 40 minutes, and then John Tyler skips town to his plantation in Virginia, assuming that he would sort of never be heard from again for 4 years. Imagine his surprise when 30 days later, William Henry Harrison dies in office. And he didn't die of pneumonia, like history tells us. He actually died, along with several other presidents after him, due to a sewage problem around the White House. So back then, the sewage problem, we won't get into the gruesome details because you haven't had dinner yet, but there was a major sewage problem that killed William Henry Harrison, likely killed James Polk, and likely killed Zachary Taylor. So the framers of the Constitution left the language very vague. The language of the Constitution does not say that when there's a vacancy in the presidency, the vice president becomes president. It says that the vice president discharges the duties of the presidency. And if you look at the language, most at the time interpreted it as if there's a vacancy, the vice president becomes an acting president, and the Secretary of State is to call a special election for the following November. But the language is vague enough that it was left to interpretation. So John Tyler has a very strong view that he now is the president. So he races back to Washington through a combination of horse-drawn carriage, steamboat, and rail. And he's ready to fight with the cabinet and fight with Congress, both of who do not believe that he's the president of the United States. He wins the battle with the cabinet, and then he spends the next 3 months fighting with Congress. He ends up setting a precedent at that moment that the vice president becomes the president. Now that precedent is important because it's not formalized until the 25th Amendment, which is ratified in 1967. So Millard Fillmore, Andrew Johnson, Chester Arthur, Theodore Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, Harry Truman, and Lyndon Johnson all become president based on a precedent set by John Tyler in 1841. And there's no provision for replacing the vice president of the United States until the ratification of the 25th Amendment in 1967 as well. So each of these accidental presidents leaves the vice presidency vacant. And by the way, 6 of the 8 of them nearly died in office as well due to a combination of illness, accident, and assassination attempts. So again, you're seeing this sort of theme of recklessness around presidential succession. So going back to 1841, John Tyler sets this precedent, ends up angering everybody. The Whigs, who know that he's really a Democrat and doesn't subscribe to their agenda, ends up formally excommunicating him from the party after he vetoes a bill for a national bank. So John Tyler ends up getting kicked out of the party and becomes a president without a party. His only path to winning election in his own right in 1844, since the Democrats don't want him back either, is to throw a wrench in the political discourse, and he decides the best way to do that is to begin covert activities to set the stage for the annexation of Texas, which he eventually accomplishes. Now remember, the vice presidency is vacant, so something else extraordinary happens during Tyler's presidency. February 28th, 1844, John Tyler is sailing on board a ship called the USS Princeton down the Potomac. And it's a day of celebration of American naval prowess and the fact that he's 48 hours away from annexing Texas. As they go by Mount Vernon, they end up firing the state-of-the-art long gun, which there's nothing that existed like it at the time, called the Peacemaker. And in tribute to the great George Washington, they fire the cannon. The gun explodes. It kills the Secretary of State. It kills the Secretary of Navy. It kills multiple ministers, multiple senators, multiple members of Congress. It kills John Tyler's favorite slave, whose mother is compensated $200. And it would have killed the nation's first accidental president had he not been below deck flirting with a 20-year-old woman who was more interested in the captain's son. Her name was Julia Gardner. As they heard the explosion, John Tyler and Julia Gardner come up to the deck. She sees that her father, who's a New York State senator, is among the dead, and she faints into the president's arms. The president scoops her up and carries her down the gangplank. She writes later on that she was startled, not realizing who was carrying her, and she nearly knocked them both overboard, which would have killed them both. They end up surviving in a weird I miss your father kind of situation. She ends up marrying him, becoming the youngest first lady in history until Grover Cleveland competes for sort of the title of cradle robber. But this is an important anecdote, because had John Tyler died in that explosion, I'm quite convinced that the Tyler precedent would not have held, and maybe Lyndon Johnson would have been an acting president. So this sort of moment in history that we don't think about around Tippecanoe and Tyler II had a profound impact on future presidents to come. So given you had these sort of 8 men who were not integrated into their administrations, none of who enjoyed a good relationship with their predecessor, all of who were out of the loop, being thrust into the pinnacle of power at some of the most seminal moments in the history of our republic, the debates in the 1840s and 1850s over slavery, the dawn of Reconstruction, World War II, the height of the Cold War, it's worth asking the question, how bad was it? How good was it? I want to tell you that we winged it and we were okay, and that it was a mixed bag and some were better than others, but I can't do that because the vision for Reconstruction was supposed to be a vision of Abraham Lincoln. Instead, the bullet of John Wilkes Booth gave us Andrew Johnson, a man who was born a racist, died a racist, the last president to own slaves, a man who didn't emancipate his own slaves until 7 months after the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, Andrew Johnson is thrown onto the ticket in 1864 because Abraham Lincoln needs a war Democrat from a border state, but also because Johnson, who owed everything to the Union and hated the Southern aristocracy, sounded like a radical Republican at the time of the 1864 election. His rhetoric on civil rights and punishment for traitors was even more forward-leaning than Abraham Lincoln, and that was only true so long as the Union was broken. Andrew Johnson, his debut as vice president begins with typhoid. He doesn't want to go to the inauguration, and he tells Lincoln he's not going to go. And Lincoln tells him the world is watching, the country is watching, you need to be here to show solidarity. So Andrew Johnson comes, he's miserable. Hannibal Hamlin, who's the incumbent outgoing vice president, who's pretty bitter, gets him pretty drunk on brandy, which is interesting because he was a teetotaler. And they end up going into the chamber, and Andrew Johnson's supposed to give 30 seconds of remarks, put his hand on the Bible, and become vice president. Instead, he delivers a 17-minute drunken tirade in which he insults every member of the cabinet except for the Secretary of Navy, whose name he can't remember, and he has to stop the proceedings to ask somebody what the name of the Secretary of the Navy is. Finally, he sort of gasps for breath, sort of like I am right now, and he puts his hand on the Bible, and he nearly stumbles and falls down. He can't deliver the oath and ends up slobbering all over the Bible. He's then supposed to fulfill another responsibility, which is to swear in the new senators, but he's too drunk to do it, so he asks a Senate clerk. He says, "Sir, I can't do this right now. You do a better job. You do it." Now, Johnson's so humiliated that he skips town, and then the next time the cabinet sees him is the evening of April 14th, 1865, at Lincoln's deathbed. Lincoln's in the Peterson home, lying diagonally on the bed. Andrew Johnson himself should have been killed that night, but George Atzerodt got drunk at a tavern nearby. And Johnson comes into the Peterson home. The cabinet is there. Everybody knows Andrew Johnson is about to become president. But like all accidental presidents, until they take the oath of office, nobody thinks about it. So a member of the cabinet comes up to him and says, "Mr. Vice President, you're making Mary Todd Lincoln extremely uncomfortable, and we need to ask you to leave." Of course, the next day he's sworn in as president, and we think about the disaster that ensues, which is civil rights are delegated to the states. You have amnesty for every single traitor from the Union. We get the Black Codes, which are the precursor to the Jim Crow laws, which come after the 1876 election, and then the story of civil rights in post-Civil War America ends up on a certain trajectory that sort of defines 100+ years. Now, there's a bookend to that, which is the story of civil rights in post-Civil War America is a tale of two presidential assassinations. In 1880, 4 years after the Jim Crow laws really begin, the election's supposed to be between James Blaine and Ulysses S. Grant for a non-consecutive third term. On the 34th ballot, everybody gets tired of machine politics, and somebody shouts out the name James Garfield. Aptly, my second daughter's middle name is Garfield because I got stuck on the Garfield chapter when my wife was pregnant with her. So he doesn't want the nomination. He's there as chief of staff to the guy running in fourth place, or campaign manager to the guy running in fourth place. So he jumps on stage and he says, "I protest. A man who does not seek the nomination cannot be given the nomination." They give it to him anyway. This is a man totally detached from machine politics, a man who hid runaway slaves as a kid, a man who wanted to abolish the spoils system, a man whose two sort of driving causes were universal education and universal suffrage. And he might have been able to reverse some of what Andrew Johnson started had a mentally ill office seeker not put a bullet in his back 4 months after he took the oath of office. So that's why I say the story of civil rights in post-Civil War America is the story of two assassinations. Now, of course, we get to the most unexpected success. My favorite is Theodore Roosevelt, but I think we all expected him to be successful, and he was probably the only one who would have been elected in his own right. But we have to go to Harry Truman. And in retrospect, we have to sort of pinch ourselves and remind ourselves what a miracle Truman was. In 1944, right here in Chicago, the Democratic Party bosses knew that FDR was a dying man. And they couldn't fathom the idea of an ultra-liberal like Henry Wallace and a Soviet sympathizer like Henry Wallace becoming president of the United States. And so they look around and they decide Harry Truman is the best anti-Wallace person to stick on the ticket. He's basically a provincial aw-shucks politician from Missouri who's not thought a lot about the world. He has a lot of baggage, but not as much baggage as Wallace. In Truman's 82 days as vice president, he only meets with FDR twice, both times superficially, doesn't get a single intelligence briefing, doesn't meet a single foreign leader, never steps foot in the map room where the war is being planned, isn't briefed on the atomic bomb. He's basically out socializing. This is made all the more remarkable by the fact that 2 weeks into his vice presidency, he gets a phone call that the president of the United States is dead. And it takes him several minutes to learn that it's one of the president's advisors, not the president. So it's not like he didn't have an opportunity to contemplate this. So April 12th, 1945, FDR takes his last breath. Harry Truman says to Eleanor Roosevelt, "Is there anything I can do for you?" She says back to him, "Is there anything I can do for you, for you're the one in trouble now?" And boy, was he in trouble. At the time of FDR's death, the Battle of Okinawa was raging. Truman had just gotten briefed on the atomic bomb and had to figure out what to do with this destructive weapon that may or may not work. He had to contemplate the realities of potentially moving 1 million men from the European theater to the Asian Pacific theater. There was a bureaucratic battle between the Army and Navy that threatened the war effort. Hitler was still hanging out in a bunker in Germany, orchestrating all kinds of nefarious activity. Churchill was a complex figure and a bit nutso. He had to spend his first 3 to 4 days in the map room literally figuring out where some of these countries were on a map. Stalin's reneging on every one of his promises from Yalta, and Truman is literally just ramping up and playing catch up. Yet in his first 4 months, Truman makes some of the most important decisions that shape the end of the war and the post-war order, and ends up this remarkable, unexpected success. And I remember I did several interviews with George H.W. Bush for the book before he passed away, and what he said to me is, I never thought much about Harry Truman. My family didn't like him, but I always felt that Harry Truman saved my life, because he believed he was preparing for a ground invasion of Japan. So those are kind of the worst and the best. Let me tell you 2 close call stories, and then we'll get into a conversation. I mentioned there's 19 times the president almost died in office. I'm going to start with a story of a woman and her purse and how she saved the New Deal. FDR, as president-elect, gets off Vincent Astor's yacht, the Norma in Miami. It's his first speech as president-elect. He delivers a 2.5-minute speech sitting on the back of a Buick convertible in his 3-car motorcade. And an Italian immigrant named Giuseppe Zangara fires 5 shots at him at 15 seconds as he's shaking the mayor of Chicago's hand, who's coincidentally in town. A woman named Lillian Cross, weighing about 100 pounds, sees him pull his .32 caliber, moves her purse from her left arm to her right arm, smacks the assailant's arm, thwarts his aim. It kills the mayor of Chicago, and it kills 3 other bystanders. It misses FDR as president-elect by about 3 to 4 inches, and that purse saved FDR's life and saved the New Deal. More remarkably, the 20th Amendment was ratified 9 days before that said if there's a vacancy with the president-elect, the vice president-elect becomes president on Inauguration Day. So what you would have had in that situation is kind of an interesting, fortunate moment where the amendment actually covered this vulnerability of succession. Now, the last close call, I'll tell you just because it always surprises people, is we're all obviously familiar with the Kennedy assassination, but how many of you know that Kennedy was nearly killed by a disgruntled postal worker as president-elect, who was the first and only suicide bomber to get within feet of killing the president-elect of the United States? A disgruntled postal worker named Richard Pavlik stalked Kennedy for an entire summer. He ended up buying a bunch of dynamite and stuffing his pants pockets with enough dynamite to blow up an entire church. He follows JFK all the way to his church in West Palm Beach, gets within 4 feet of him with his hand in his pocket on the trigger, ready to kill himself and the president-elect, but catches some children out of the corner of his eye and decides he'll do it another day, and then he's subsequently arrested in a routine traffic stop. So the story is just filled with these colorful anecdotes, and you realize just the richness of our history, but it's kind of fascinating, right? When I started writing this book 5.5 years ago, there was no Donald Trump on the scene. The president of the United States was a relatively young guy. Today, we are in the longest period of time without a president dying in office. We have the oldest president in the history of the republic, and the 2 candidates who are polling the highest on the Democratic side are both in their 70s. So if ever there was a time to reflect back on the history of presidential succession, the vice president of the United States, and just some of these fascinating anecdotes, I think it's this current moment. So with that, I guess we'll have a conversation. Do you want me here?
Thanks, Jared. Take a breath, please. You packed more information in a shorter period of time than I've seen anyone do for a long time. But it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Wonderful to have you, Chicago, back and to talk about this really fascinating story. Who the hell writes a book about presidents who were accidental? Where does that come from?
So when I tell people that I have a book out, this is before the book got published, they said, oh, is it a book about cyber war? No. Is it a book about foreign policy? No. And so then they sort of scratch their head and look at me really puzzled, and they say, what the hell is the book about? And I said, it's about 8 dead presidents. And they look at me even more confused, unless you grew up with me. My parents, when I was 8 years old, bought me a children's book called The Buck Stops Here. It was one of those rhyming books, one president per page, and I still remember it. 35 is young John F., another president shot to death. And so when you're 8 years old, my parents wanted to turn me into or 10 and 7 Johnson A. They almost took his job away, right? So my parents wanted to turn me into this precocious kid, but an 8-year-old, zeroes in on the 8 times the president died in office. So my takeaway from the history of the presidents was, Mom, Dad, what happens when you die? Or what's a deranged lunatic? Or what's assassination? And my poor parents, they didn't know much about McKinley, let alone having to explain to me why his head was keeled over and filled with blood. So I spent my entire life reading about the 8 presidents who died and the 8 presidents who ascended upon their death. And the interest sort of manifested itself in different ways over time, reading and collecting presidential memorabilia. I have locks of presidential hair, which we can get into at another time. But in writing this book, what I sort of came to realize is, careers are meant to be portfolios of curiosity, and you should diversify and hedge so that you never wake up in the morning curious about something without an avenue to explore it. So when my wife was pregnant with our now 5-year-old, I was annoying everybody, and I needed an activity, so I would stop annoying everybody. So I decided to tap into this childhood interest and put a book proposal together, and here we are 5.5 years later.
What are you going to do next? I mean, so if this has kept you busy for 27, 28 years, at least mentally, and 5 years, and it's extraordinarily well researched. You've just you heard the footnotes, right? And they were part of the presentation. But what do you do now? I mean, this is a lifelong passion that's done.
It's really hard. I'm like not okay. Seriously, I mean, you have one childhood interest like this, and while I will never know what postpartum depression is, I feel like this is the closest I'll ever get to it. So I guess I'll collect more hair. But I don't know. It's hard. I mean, I love telling these stories, and I tried. The book is written. I tried to write the book with the same childhood enthusiasm that I had as an 8-year-old, sort of adjusted for seriousness. But I wanted to make history fun again. I work in a sector where I think we have overcorrected for innovation and the future at great disparagement to the past and history. And I think some of what accounts for the myopia that has led us down the path that we're on right now is a sort of a lack of attention to history. And what's amazing about this book is, for all the hysteria and hyperbole about today's politics, the book is filled with anecdotes of, historic versions of what we're seeing today. And it doesn't absolve us of responsibility for all the problems of today, but it's a much more daunting challenge when you look at something and you say you've never seen it before, because it means you can't then rely on history to help inform you as to how you troubleshoot it.
Talk a little bit, and I want to get back to the book in a minute, but your day job, in the tech sector, it's what you've devoted yourself to for more than a decade. You've been extremely successful in that work. How do you take that history and make it relevant to what you're doing during day in and day out, thinking through new ideas about how you can use technology in different ways?
So I would say there's 2 ways that. So I will say, when I started, you write a book for one of 2 reasons. So the last time I was at the Chicago Council, it was to talk about the new digital age, which Eric Schmidt and I co-authored together. And that's a book you write because you have stuff to say and you want to say it before somebody else. This is a book you write because you want to rationalize your hobbies. But when you spend enough time on something, you find connections in all sorts of ways. So you could, like, any time in the last 5.5 years, ask me what I had for lunch, and I would turn it into a conversation about Chester Arthur. But it is interesting how it ties back to the day job. job. And there's sort of an emotional way and a substantive content way. The emotional way, I guess it gets it when people ask me, how did you find time to do this? What I always say is, like, I don't ask you how you find time to work your day job and train for a half marathon or do transcendental meditation or grow your organic garden. Not that there's anything wrong with any of that, but these are common things people talk about in my sector. Like, for me, history is my meditative state. It's a way to hold our hyper obsession with the future and innovation and accountability, or future and innovation accountable. And working on this book trains me to reflect back on where we came from in order to understand where we were coming today. So I'll give you an example of how this translates post-book, which is I just bought a bunch of books on the 30 Years' War and the 100 Years' War. Why? They're like really thick, right? So why would I do that? Well, I keep going to conferences and I hear the same mass hysteria, which is, what are we going to do about China? What are we going to do about AI? There's these sort of sweeping conclusions that we come to, none of which are prescriptive. And what you conclude is there's a general sense that we're in the midst of a global conflagration of sorts. And we see all the attributes of a global conflict, but we can't seem to figure out when it started, what the root causes were, who we're fighting against, what we're trying to win exactly, what our objectives are. We just sort of know that there's a major global crisis. So I asked myself the question, when was the last time the war was in a global and perpetual state of conflict where everything around when it started and what it's all about was completely ambiguous? So my hypothesis was, I remember learning about the 100 Years' War and the 30 Years' War sometime in my education. The general length of those wars leads me to believe there was probably something ambiguous about them. And so I buy a bunch of thick books and I reflect back on that history and I see if it teaches me anything or informs any thinking about this ambiguous moment that we're in today.
Let me go back to the book. One of the essences of The Accidental President is that they weren't meant to be president. They didn't prepare for it. They weren't just the defeated, in the more modern period where they are the defeated hangers-on of a campaign in some ways. They were truly accidental. What did you learn tracking the fact the day they became president and then actually acted it in that sense of leadership? What did you learn about how do you become a president?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with the accidental presidents, right? Because the unique aspect of their ascension is the death of the person the people wanted. And they were all somebody who the public either didn't think about or didn't want at all. And so what they're each sort of contending with is one, recognizing there's a sense of illegitimacy to them, which is, by the way, heightened by the fact that for none of them are they formally and legally the president, again, until you have the 25th Amendment. But they're all grappling with the fact that they've inherited somebody else's policies, they've inherited somebody else's advisors, and they really grapple with how to engage with these men that they inherit. So in the case of Millard Fillmore, he takes the oath of office and then sacks the entire cabinet, and then Congress goes into recess for 9 months at the most polarized moment in American history, literally a time when a senator pulled a gun on another senator in the chamber. So I think in terms of readiness, I guess it gets to a question of what makes a vice president ready to be president. The ideal situation is you're brought into the loop by the administration and you're getting the intelligence briefings and you know what's going on, in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy. But that wasn't the case for any of these accidental presidents. And so what I was struck by is, despite the fact that it literally kept happening, and despite the fact that you had all of these close calls in between, there's no evidence that a single one of the accidental presidents, including Theodore Roosevelt, who literally spent his entire life salivating over being president, spent any time preparing for a reality that they might one day, assume the office. And this, to me, the utter recklessness of it is the part that I find, in some respects, most astonishing.
So let me talk about the recklessness, because we've never had the situation where we went beyond the vice president. But we have this very strange line of succession. I mean, it is about as weird as you can go, right? You have a vice president, then you go to the speaker and the president pro tem of the Senate, and God forbid you go from Pence to Pelosi to Grassley, and then you go to Pompeo. I mean, just think about Who came up with that? Do you have any insight on that? What's the line of succession? Where did that come from?
So I read the deliberations from the drafting process, and again, all of it was sort of cobbled together. I think what's amazing to me about the founding fathers, and continues to be amazing to me about the founding fathers, is they had the wisdom to set the bar really high for amending the Constitution, and they recognized the imperfect nature of their language in the Constitution, and they expected us to experiment with different laws along the way, and use that experimentation to inform moments where we amended the Constitution. So it's changed at different times in history, right? So I'll start, basically up, the first chapter of it, I think you could say, is the Constitution plus the Presidential Succession Act of 1792. And the best way to explain what all that looks like is in the context of the Lincoln assassination night. So Lincoln was assassinated and died. Andrew Johnson was supposed to be killed and died, but as I mentioned before, Atzerodt got drunk nearby. So what did the Constitution and the Presidential Succession Act of 1792 say if you have a double vacancy? While the Constitution wasn't clear that the vice president becomes president, the Constitution and the Succession Act were very clear that if you have a double vacancy, the president pro tem at that time, not the speaker, the president pro tem becomes an acting president, and the Secretary of State is the only one with the constitutional authority to make them the acting president, and then they set a special election for the 1st November following the vacancy. Now, this is very interesting for the night of the assassination, because who was the Secretary of State? So remember, Lincoln's supposed to be dead, Andrew Johnson's supposed to be dead. The president pro tem is a man named Lafayette Sabine Foster, but the person who can make Foster the acting president is William Seward. Well, Lewis Powell burst into Seward's home that night and stabbed him repeatedly, and taking him within an inch of his life. And so Seward would have died. Okay, well, interestingly, the Constitution's also very clear if there's a vacancy in the presidency, a vacancy in the vice presidency, and a vacancy in the Secretary of State. The person with the constitutional authority to then make the president pro tem the acting president is the Assistant Secretary of State, who at the time was the Deputy Secretary of State. That was Frederick Seward, who was nearly bludgeoned to death by the handle of the gun as Lewis Powell made his way in to stab Seward. So you very really could have had a situation where Lincoln was dead, the vice president was dead, the Secretary of State was dead, and the Assistant Secretary of State was dead. So even though you had a president pro tem, there would have been nobody with the constitutional authority to make him an acting president and call a special election. Then 1886, they get rid of the president pro tem and speaker, and they replace it with the cabinet. Same thing, acting president, et cetera. And then 1947, they reinstate the Speaker of the House and the president pro tem in that order, and then it's formalized with the 25th Amendment, again, where there's no more acting president, they just become the president.
So it's after the 25th Amendment in some ways that presidents and people who run for president start taking the vice presidency kind of more seriously.
We never take it seriously. We almost made Sarah Palin the vice president. I actually think that that's a safely bipartisan conclusion, right? So, I mean, she was almost a heartbeat away from a very old president.
All right, so we don't take a president. Knowing what you know now that knowing what you've known since you're 8 years old, how should we think about this? What is the right way of thinking about the vice president? Do we think about young people? Old presidents should have young vice presidents. How should you think about it from a governing perspective rather than from a political perspective, which still is Sarah Palin being an example? One of the reasons why we choose the vice presidents that we do, which is a political decision, not a governing decision.
So I'll tell you what I think the answer is to that, and I'll tell you why we're not set up to do that. The only thing that should matter in a vice president is this somebody who, should the unthinkable happen, is this somebody who can effectively lead the country forward. You don't have to agree with their policies. You don't have to, you can agree or disagree, but is this somebody that you could imagine, like, are they capable of leading the country, or would they be like an utter disaster? Are they completely incompetent? We're not set up to do this because the candidate, basically ever since 1960, has more or less the sole discretion over who they choose as their running mate, which biases towards whenever it's time to choose a running mate, how are you doing in the polls? You're up against the ropes. You want to win this state, appease this constituency. You need to balance the ticket for like something that's going on at that particular moment in the election. And that's not a way to think about, is this somebody that you'll integrate into your administration? Is this somebody that you'll keep in the loop in your administration? Is this somebody who you could imagine being president of the United States? Now, historically, by the way, the candidate didn't choose the vice president either. It's just nobody cared about the vice president. You were thrown on the ticket, because you were like ready to retire. In Theodore Roosevelt's case, it was a punishment because the New York party bosses wanted to get rid of him, or you needed to bring the party together. So if you're the candidate and you have the sole discretion over this, there's the electoral piece of this, but then there's another aspect of this, which is if you're a candidate, you don't want to pick somebody who's more exciting than you. And you don't want to pick someone who's so unexciting that they're going to embarrass you. So what this bias is towards is picking the JV, junior varsity version of yourself. Now, my problem with this is I don't want the junior varsity version of the person we elect to end up as president of the United States. I want the varsity captain. And so the whole system is fundamentally flawed and I think unlikely to change.
So what happens when the vice president chooses his president, as we had in 2000?
Well, I think these things are very much a case-by-case basis, right? I think that it's people like to say everything that I'm saying is fine and good, but it seems like we've picked vice presidents in the last 25 years who are perfectly capable of being president. And again, I remind people of the Sarah Palin example.
Yeah, no, there were two candidates, and sometimes even more.
Yeah, but it is interesting. Going back to 2000, I did a very long interview with Vice President Cheney for this book. And I think he spoke to me for so long because he couldn't believe I wasn't asking him about Iraq or Afghanistan. Although I did ask him one question, because the only time the 25th Amendment has been exercised for a presidential disability is for colonoscopies. It should have been exercised when Reagan was shot, but Jim Baker didn't want to set the precedent of the cabinet determining that the president was disabled, so they didn't use it. And it was really constitutionally horrific that they didn't. So I said to him, when you were president for 3 hours and 27 minutes, had you gotten intelligence that they found Osama bin Laden and he was in this particular building, but you needed to act now and take the shot, would you have done it? And without hesitation, he said, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, what's different between that 3 hours and 25 minutes and the rest of the presidency?
Yeah. He did tell a great story. He did tell a great story about Gerald Ford. So poor Gerald Ford had 2 women try to assassinate him 35 days apart. So Lynette Squeaky Fromm shoots at him at point blank and the gun malfunction, and she sort of freaks out. And then 35 days later, he's in Sacramento, and he comes downstairs to give the speech, and it's one of those elevators that opens vertically. And Cheney talks about how the elevator door hit Ford on the top of his head, cracked his skull open. They rush him upstairs, give him stitches. He comes back downstairs, and then Sarah Jane Moore fires shots at him. So he basically was like, that was a really bad day for the president.
We're going to open up to questions for the audience, but so get ready to think about your questions. One of the accidental presidents you didn't talk about in a presentation, it was short, though you had a lot in there, LBJ. Probably the most tragic in some ways, the man who did more for civil rights than any other president before or since, and yet became this very tragic figure because Vietnam literally ate his presidency and ate him alive. Talk a little bit about how he was also the very much older man with the very young president, really not thinking about becoming president. This was going to be the highlight of, or the low light, depending on your point of view, of his political life. Here, all of a sudden, November 22nd, 1963, he gets this opportunity. How does he approach that? How does he take it on?
So writing a chapter on Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson in particular, is a daunting task. Because you look at this, and you're exhausted from the 5.5 years, and you're like, what can I possibly write that Robert Caro hasn't already written? I mean, the guy literally has written so much about LBJ that he can literally write a book called Working, and it's a bestseller. But it turns out this is what's amazing about history, is no matter how much has been written about a president, there's still so many incredible gems to search for, because it's very personal. You end up digging in and doing archival research around the things that you're most interested in. And I would say there's two things that I focused on with LBJ. One, I very much believe that he was either going to have to resign as vice president or be kicked off the ticket the week after the assassination, had the assassination not happened. So he had an aide in the Senate named Bobby Baker, and at the time of the assassination, LBJ was engulfed in a massive scandal and investigation. And what I found from my interviews with journalists at the time is both CBS and Time had the full full dossier on what LBJ had done and the kickbacks he'd gotten, and they were ready to go public with it the following week. So that trip to Texas revealed for the Kennedy campaign that LBJ didn't have the juice in Texas that he had in 1960. And of course, we know the story of how Robert Kennedy and the Kennedy cabal couldn't stand him. So they either, I believe, when that dossier went public the following week, would have pushed him to resign or forced him off the ticket. We know that CBS and Time Life made a deliberate decision after the assassination to put the story back in a box and bury it, something which would never happen today. And they decided the country had been through such an jaw-dropping transition, and they couldn't handle LBJ coming into the presidency, by the way, without a vice president, without a 25th Amendment, and then break this scandal at the height of the Cold War. So I think that to me was a really interesting discovery. But then the second thing is the narrative on Kennedy and Johnson typically goes, if you didn't have the Kennedy assassination, you wouldn't have had civil rights happen in '64, but you also in '65 and so forth, but you also wouldn't have had Vietnam. This is a more controversial view, but nonetheless, you can read the book and you see how I back it up. I believe that the guardians of Kennedy, you can absolutely not absolve LBJ for responsibility in Vietnam, but the guardians of Kennedy's reputation, Schlesinger, Sorensen, have done a masterful job absolving Kennedy of responsibility for sending us down the slippery slope in Vietnam. It's Kennedy who doubles the foreign assistance budget. It's Kennedy who escalates the number of advisors. The troop rotation home that's often cited was part of a regular rotation, not part of a de-escalation strategy. And the full effects and aftermath of the sort of the turning the other way with the coup of the president of South Vietnam were not fully understood. I don't think Kennedy was as predisposed to go down the path of 500,000 troops as LBJ, but given the circumstances, he may have ended up somewhere close to that. It's all speculative. I think the tragedy of Lyndon Johnson is he was destined. He was determined to be a great domestic president, and he didn't demonstrate the courage on foreign policy that he was able to demonstrate on domestic policy. And so it was painful. I'd go to sleep at night listening to the LBJ tapes, and it's painful to listen to them. He knows he knows this is a terrible idea, and he knows this is a disaster, but he can't muster up the strength to challenge a group of Kennedy advisors, many of who I think he should have gotten rid of.
With that, let's open it up to questions to the audience, which just terrific synopsis here of a really complicated problem as so much else. Please raise your arm and we'll get a microphone to you. And if you don't want to participate by speaking, you can also go online, or if you're joining us online, go to the web and type in chi.cnf.io, and you will be able to ask a question that way. We'll go up here right up front to start off. Right here.
Hi, thank you very much. It was more fun than I thought it would be. It's a hard question. It's a hard question to answer because until we know our candidate coming up for the president, but what should the Democrats, what do you think they'd be looking for this time in a vice president?
First, before I answer your question, it's totally fair to not expect Millard Fillmore and like John Tyler and Chester Arthur to be sort of oodles of fun. So you're forgiven. Hopefully we made it fun and we got you thinking about all these people that are kind of lost in the annals of history. I write about this a little bit in the afterword of the book, which is kind of how we should approach the question of the vice president. With the caveat that I don't really know how to make this feasible. It's just sort of, if I had my druthers, what I would do. I would wrestle the sort of autonomous decision-making authority away from the candidate at the top of the ticket. And you could imagine, you could imagine two things. One, kind of a super delegate type model where you have certain delegates who, instead of given super authority to have their vote count extra for the top of the ticket, their vote counts the same as everyone else for the ticket, but they're given a special authority to also vote for a running mate. And you build more party consensus around this, and it biases hopefully more towards somebody who represents other aspects of the party and somebody who would be sort of fit the bill of somebody who could lead. But the other thing is, if you look at the Harry Truman example, it really should be required by law or it should be legislated that the vice president is legally empowered to request intelligence briefings, build a national security apparatus. And we take this for granted because it hasn't been a problem really since starting with George H.W. Bush. The vice presidents have been pretty integrated, particularly on foreign policy. But again, go back to my Sarah Palin example. Had McCain-Palin won, again, I don't think this is a partisan comment. I just don't see her like sitting at the Situation Room table, like being involved in major decisions. I would imagine she would have been sort of like pretty cast aside. And you need the vice president to understand what's going on, especially given our fast-paced world.
I'll go in all the way in the back. Euler, yeah.
Jared, given what you've seen in the U.S., are there other countries that have a presidential system around the world who handle succession well, notwithstanding the ones that have parliamentary systems?
Monarchies are pretty clear, but no, I'm joking. I don't know. It's a good question. I haven't looked at other democracies and how they do presidential succession. I do think it's interesting. I mean, it begs another interesting question, which is the world in general has not had to contend with deaths in office of much, in recent years. I mean, you have, the assassination of prominent people like Benazir Bhutto, but she wasn't in power when it happened. I'm sure I'm missing examples of prominent leaders who've died in office, but it's not a very common thing anymore. But humans are humans, especially, we might live longer, but the stress of being, a president is much greater. And I worry about this, by the way, on the campaign. Each campaign is more grueling than the previous campaign. Each presidential administration is more grueling than the previous presidential administration. And what I'm struck by throughout history is a lot of these presidents didn't really do anything. I mean, Chester Arthur literally was so lazy and did so little that his advisors had what they called a productivity basket, and they filled it with important looking documents, and they would follow him around so that nobody thought he didn't do anything. Calvin Coolidge basically slept all day. So they basically met, before the end of the spoils system, they basically met with office seekers. Congress every other year used to go on recess for 9 months. So people didn't work that hard. So the grueling nature of all of this, it's actually like astonishing. We've gotten very lucky in modern times that this hasn't happened more often. And I think the thing that I've been reflecting on is, regardless of what your politics are, nobody should hope that something happens to the president. My concern is in this particular moment, the difference between this current moment and past moments is I worry that it would have a very polarized and sort of dividing aftermath, which we've never had in the history of the Republic.
So a related question coming here from online that looks at foreign leaders, and to what extent have foreign nations sought to exploit the moment of maximum vulnerability, maximum weakness, when a president, is there any evidence when a president accidentally comes to power?
So I actually looked at this because I was curious because of my foreign policy background. There's not a lot of evidence that foreign actors had tried to exploit presidential succession, in part because despite the ambiguity and despite the vagueness of the Constitution, it was pretty seamless. I mean, I think it's a testament to the precedent set by John Tyler that, when Zachary Taylor dies in office after a year in 1850, literally less than 10 years later, nobody questions whether Millard Fillmore is the president. The one exception to this, what was interesting is while I was working on the Kennedy to Johnson chapter, it's when President Trump declassified all those Kennedy documents. So just based on sheer timing, I have a lot of the documents cited in the book, and reading the KGB reaction to the Kennedy assassination was fascinating because they believed it was a conspiracy from the generals and that LBJ was organizing the generals. And you look at how they're trying to quickly build a dossier on LBJ and what he's about, and is he sort of more militarily inclined? And so it's actually worth, I cite some of them in the book, but it's worth looking at some of these declassified documents and just reading what the Soviet Union thought was actually happening in the United States.
So that read 7 days in November, yeah. I guess. Adele Simmons, right here.
To what extent do you think the vice presidential candidate impacts the presidential election results?
If I look historically, unless the vice presidential candidate is an embarrassment, I don't think they matter. Which is why, going back, I didn't really answer your question very well, so I'll revisit that in answering yours. We have to resist the urge to focus on winning a state and appeasing. There's no historic evidence that it does either of those things. It does not guarantee you the state. If you win the state, it's a matter of coincidence. People vote for the top of the ticket, not the number 2 on the ticket. It is important. It did matter in the sort of era of patronage because the vice presidency was seen as a patronage funnel, so it did matter in terms of unifying the party. But in today's world, like if you look at today, right, you have all of these candidates running on the Democratic side. If there was ever an opportunity to look at the field and say, let's use this as an opportunity to set somebody else up to be the future of the party, and let's not care about what state they're from or what constituency they appease. It does not, like, it is ahistoric to associate a vice presidential candidate with any electoral benefit. Like, I understand that we fall into this trap every single time, but now having looked at elections throughout history for the past 5.5 years, I've looked specifically at this question. I have not seen evidence to corroborate it.
Let me go back for a minute to the online audience, and great question here. Given your study of the situation, what's your conclusion? Are our institutions strong, or have we just gotten really lucky?
I mean, I think our institutions are pretty resilient. So again, the wrench in this is the Andrew Johnson catastrophe. But the fact that we sustained a presidential, a constitutional vulnerability like this for as long as we did is pretty remarkable. But I think about this slightly differently, which is I mentioned earlier that everything we're seeing today, we've seen some version of in history. From it looks different now and it plays out in different theaters. The one caveat to that, and I always say when it really is new, it's daunting because then you can't use history to inform you. If I fast forward 100 years and I ask, how will we reflect back on this moment? This will be the moment defined by social media. And what that means is this will be the era in which governments struggled to take the pulse of the population, and all of us as individuals struggled to be precise about what was going on. And that's important because all of this noise creates a situation where governments and people either overreact or underreact. So you had partisan polarization at the dawn of the Republic, then you had long strings of sectional polarization, you had inter-party patronage polarization, and now we've got partisan polarization again. We've never had a harder measurement problem in terms of understanding what is really going on in terms of the polarization we're seeing today. And that really is a new phenomenon, this signal to noise problem. At the height of polarized debates around sectionalism, we more or less knew where people were and who was on which side and how big each side was, but this is sort of on another level.
Let's go right here up front to left public.
Thank you for the truly inspirational performance here, just interesting. I asked this as a parent of 2 11-year-olds who are interested in history, and just thinking back, I was taught, and I'm sure that 99% of us were taught the romantic version of American history, that everything just seemed perfect throughout our 225 plus years. Maybe a curveball here. How would you suggest we should be teaching our kids in order to understand maybe precisely what you just finished with in terms of the new polarization and how things are changing? How should we be teaching our kids to actually process this information to be useful to us and be as inspired and energized about our history and how to apply it going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think about this a lot because I have a 5-year-old and I have a 3-year-old, and the 5-year-old in particular, they've watched me, write this book, and it's amazing how even at that young age, what they've digested about the presidents, and they live with all this presidential memorabilia in the apartment, and like my
the locks of hair.
Yeah, the locks of hair. My 3-year-old runs around like talking about Teddy Roosevelt, and they've never gone to see the play Hamilton, but they love the soundtrack, and like I'll be watching Morning Joe on the bike in the morning, and one of the hosts will mention Washington, meaning the city, and the 3-year-old will be like, George Washington. And so what I think is interesting about presidents is 2 things as a parent. And again, my training data here is a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. presidents are these characters that adults and kids can enjoy in a very similar way. So I have this book called Kid Presidents that I read to my children. I enjoy reading it to them as much as they enjoy having it. Like I learn from it. So it's this opportunity to really enjoy the history together. That's the sort of optimistic side of it. And then also, one other thing on the optimistic side, it doesn't all have to be Disney characters. I always thought that there was something special about Disney, that kids were captivated by Mickey Mouse and Goofy and all the others. I think it's just the power of characters. As a child, my kids are captivated by these characters who were presidents, and so so I think these are all, how you teach it is very personal, right? So, I think I'm very comfortable when I talk to, when my daughter says what happened to Abraham Lincoln, I say he was shot, and she said, why did he get shot? I said, because the country was like, I talk to her like an adult, and maybe that's a good reason. Maybe that will work. Maybe that's not. But I find that I want them to see me being honest about our history, and I try to stay with the facts as opposed to too much interpretation. But I think the way we teach history to our children, I think it's okay to do it in a kind of customized way that's comfortable for you. Some people might want to really get into digging into the faults of the founding fathers and not revering them. Some people might want to say those were different times, and I think it's okay to do either. I think it's just sort of how you want to teach history to your kids.
So, cartoon version of the book coming out anytime soon, or hadn't thought about that. Graphic novel.
I sold the movie rights, so it's being made into an eight-part series.
Terrific. Congratulations.
And it's as I said, look, I wanted these stories. You see when I'm up here, I don't get me wrong, I love my day job, but I really get electrified telling these stories because it triggers the childhood instincts, right? And seeing people get excited about these hidden stories and gems. I didn't even tell you the story about the first average American to troll the president and get a response. Like, that's exciting too.
Let's go here in the middle. Yeah, right. Don.
I've got a comment on something that was said by one of the earlier questions, and that is you talked about the presidents, or about who the vice president is, not making a difference. I can tell you a difference in 1960, where clearly Lyndon Johnson being on the ticket helped John Kennedy narrowly carry Texas over Richard Nixon. And I would appreciate your thought on that. Secondly, as far as vice president goes now, and I mean, this started with Agnew. When he resigned, Congress was able to approve Gerald Ford as vice president and subsequently Nelson Rockefeller. Isn't that end of it pretty well carved in stone now?
Yeah, so on the first question, I'm not saying that it never helps win a state. I'm just saying the narrative that picking a vice president gets you the state or wins you the constituency. More often than not, it doesn't accomplish that. There's certainly instances where it helps tip the balance, but statistically, if that's what you're going for the vice president, the evidence suggests that more often than not, it fails to accomplish what you want to accomplish, mainly because people don't care about the second spot on the ticket. I agree, it was very close. It was very close in Texas in 1960, and there's plenty of evidence that LBJ helped tip the balance, so that you can never really prove that.
The balance was tipped here in Chicago,
yeah,
but.
And on your second point, the first time that the 25th Amendment is put in practice is to pluck Gerald Ford from Michigan's 5th district to replace Spiro T. Agnew. And so yeah, that process is now very well, and that was very seamless as well. But that was the first time that the 25th Amendment was actually implemented.
Question right here in the middle.
Thank you for a lovely talk, I should say. Two things. The power of the presidency has gone way up. I mean, the duties, the responsibilities have gone way up. Just in generally, as we live in a very complicated world. The second thing has been the gradual shift of power from the legislative branch to the presidency. So how do we reset this thing? Professor Yu, I'm famous for these torture memos, had a suggestion that what we do is to increase the power of the legislative branch, so it actually, again, has more power than the presidency because that was what was intended in our Constitution. So, I mean, I think the responsibility to the president, in my mind, is a bit too much. Anything happens in the world, and you have to have a White House give a statement. So how do we sort of bring it more in line so the job becomes manageable also?
So it's very hard. I mean, so we're in if you look at modern times, it's the era of foreign policy, and the president has an enormous amount of power and authority on foreign policy, especially with the War Powers Act. I often get asked the question, why were so few presidents, reelected historically, and why does it seem like more of a modern phenomenon? I think it happens more in modern times because foreign policy is such an active thing for presidents to be involved in. I mean, if you just look at the Constitution and the enormous amount of powers that the president has in this area, I don't know how you change it. I mean, we've come a long way from the 1840s where William Henry Harrison, at least in his 30 days as president, decided that the cabinet was going to be one man, one vote, including himself, and he pledged a single term. But there was tremendous deference to the legislature historically. But you do have these. You look at Andrew Jackson, you look at Andrew Johnson. You had these moments where executives really sort of tested the notion of legislative supremacy.
The book is Accidental Presidents, 8 Men Who Changed the World. Jared Cohen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Maybe with an anecdote.